You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hello and welcome to Campus Talks, the podcast from Times Higher Education that seeks insight and advice on all aspects of the global university sector. I'm Eliza Compton, Deputy Editor of Campus. Today we're looking at academic writing, and specifically at a step many scholars overlook when they're preparing their book manuscript for submission. I'm talking about developmental editing. It's the revising stage, after you've got your ideas on the page, but before you submit your work to a publisher, or when it's time to take in changes after peer review. My guest is Laura Portwood-Stacer. Laura is a developmental editor and founder of Manuscript Works, an LA-based consultancy that assists writers in drafting, editing, and connecting with scholarly publishers. She is also an experienced journal editor, public speaker, workshop facilitator, and the author of The Book Proposal, a guide for scholarly authors, as well as Make Your Manuscript Work, which came out last year. Laura is a consultant, but much of the advice she offers in this conversation supports the skills scholars need for self-editing. That is, how you can make your own writing better and help it resonate with readers and publishers. Her cyclical developmental approach focuses on big picture elements of a text: argument, evidence, structure, and style. But we also talk about how to find confidence in your voice, why the editing phase is not the time to be polishing your grammar, and how title and chapter headings can supercharge your ideas. So let's hear from Laura Portwood-Stacer. Hi Laura, and welcome to the Campus Talks podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to start with a question that opens your book, Make Your Manuscript Work, which is: what is manuscript development and what do developmental editors do?
Yeah, so manuscript development is the term I give to the stage of revising a manuscript or editing it that comes, after you've written it, it's drafted. That's like getting it on the page. But then it needs to be developed further before it's ready to move on to its next step, which may be sending it to a publisher. It may be revising after peer review to get that final approval for publication. It's all the things you need to do to it before you're polishing it and like making sure every word is right and every punctuation mark. So it's sort of developing it, bringing it along further on its journey. So what developmental editors do is manuscript development. And we're looking at the big picture of the text. We're looking at four fundamental aspects of the manuscript. And I call those aspects argument, evidence, structure, and style. So those are the really fundamental features of the text that make it what it is and make it either acceptable to a publisher, or if any of those areas is lacking, makes it not work and not able to achieve what the author is trying to get across.
So it's the stage just before you submit to a publisher, if we're talking about a book manuscript.
Yeah, it could be, or I think development doesn't end at that point either. So you do want to get it developed to where you feel ready to send it to a publisher, but then there are going to be further stages of development after you get feedback from the publisher or after it goes out for peer review if we're talking about an academic manuscript. Sometimes even after peer review and after revision, there may be some final tweaks that need to happen so that it really lands with the intended readership. So the reason why I call it a manuscript development cycle is because it repeats. It's like a wheel that keeps rolling, and an author is going to have to go back into that cycle at various stages in the publishing timeline.
That makes sense. I imagine that it's not completely cut and dried as to what the difference is between a final draft and a second final draft, for example.
Absolutely.
So it is a bit of an ongoing process. But how does the author know when the draft phase is done and it's time to move on to developing and either do this process themselves or get someone like you involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's helpful to think about the writing process. And, often when we're writing, we're just trying to figure out what we think about our topic. So the initial draft is often just like getting thoughts down, right? We're not necessarily thinking about how are those thoughts going to land with a reader. But that's what manuscript development is about making sure that the ideas aren't just there on the page, but that they are presented in a way that is going to make sense, that's going to, show off those ideas to best effect, be most persuasive. And so I would say you're ready for the development phase, like once you've gotten the ideas down and out of your head and on the page. But that's going to look different for every writer. Some writers are going to feel like, okay, I've got the bare bones down and now I'm ready to sort of refine. And some are going to want to get every idea they've ever had about the topic down on the page. And that's just a matter of, different ways of thinking and different processes. But I would say you want to be now thinking about developing a manuscript once you're ready to turn to your reader and to publishers and to think about where does this manuscript need to go in the world versus what did I need to sort of get out of my brain and onto the page.
So is it almost like when you're stepping into the reader's shoes and starting to think about how does this book read or how does this
Hmm.
piece of writing read rather than how do I feel about writing it?
Yes, yeah. Yeah. And that is honestly a stage many writers never get to or don't have the insight or haven't been trained, I guess, really, or received the guidance on getting to that point of at some point you do have to think about the reader. It's not just your self-expression, right? Because as scholarly writers, we are writing with a purpose. And we ideally have some sort of change we want to bring about in the world, right? Even if that's among a very small audience or a small niche academic field, we do have to be thinking about how those ideas are going to land with our readers if we want them to have the effect to work in the way we want them to work.
Yeah, well, absolutely. You're thinking about communicating either research or new ideas, new theories, and it's important that your reader can go with you and can understand
Yeah.
what it is you're trying to communicate. Do you think that writers think about the writing process in terms of these sorts of stages? Are people generally familiar with this idea of developmental editing, or is it something that you have to say, look, there is this extra phase between finishing your draft and doing the line edit that you need to think about? So, thinking about structure and argument and evidence and things.
Yeah, I don't think most writers are consciously aware of this, the idea of these stages in the process. That's part of why I wrote the book, is sort of bring awareness and to hopefully bring some clarity to the process. I think it can feel really amorphous, like, oh, I've got to write this thing and I've got this, I want to get it published and I'll just kind of do something and hopefully it'll happen. And I think, the stage I'm breaking down here often just gets folded into, well, I'm writing a manuscript or I'm revising my manuscript. But it does feel very fuzzy, I think, and writers haven't gotten guidance on what that should actually look like or what it can actually look like. And so, I'm offering this tool of the manuscript development cycle for people like myself who like a system, who like a set of steps to follow, who like to know that they are doing the right thing and they are, making progress and not just like sitting there tinkering and hoping the result is effective. And so as a writer, when I was just an academic and a writer, I wasn't aware of really editing or anything about that. But then having become a professional developmental editor, then I became intimately aware with the stage of developmental editing. And that is something that's, well known in the publishing industry, isn't as well known to academic writers. So that's with this book, I'm trying to sort of bridge that and have people see that that is a distinct phase and that it may be helpful for you to think about it as you're working on your manuscript.
Well, it's certainly, in reading the book, it was certainly very interesting in thinking about how you go about unpicking and systematizing that editing process. You mentioned that you're also an academic, you've worked in academic publishing, and you're a writer yourself. How did you get interested in developmental editing?
So I was an academic, and when I was still teaching and working at a university, I was invited to become an associate editor of a journal in my field. And I was with my co-editor. We were sort of in charge of the essays section and the book reviews. So it was shorter pieces of writing, and we didn't go through the whole peer review process with our part of the journal. So we had a very short turnaround time in publishing those essays. We would like put out a call for papers, we would get submissions, and then we had about 6 weeks to make those submissions ready to submit for publication, which is much shorter than, a full journal article length. And so we weren't in the position to, send things out to peer review, get feedback, have the author take their months to go revise. We had to be like, this has potential. We want to publish it. Here's what needs to happen to it to get it ready in the next 6 weeks. So we got very good at communicating with our authors about the strengths of their essays, what needed improvement. It was often the argument needed clarification, maybe some structural things. What I found was that the authors were so appreciative of someone reading their work that closely and taking it really seriously and not just saying, well, here's my problems with it. You go off and fix it and come back when you're ready, of saying, here are the problems with it and here's how you can fix it. And so that's what made me think, well, maybe I could do this full time and not just as my sort of side volunteer journal editing gig. And maybe I could help people with longer manuscripts and things that are really important to their careers. So I ended up leaving my academic position when the contract expired and becoming a full-time editor.
So, with manuscript works, do you work exclusively with books or do you still work on shorter pieces as well?
I work almost exclusively with book authors. So I don't do one-to-one developmental editing anymore. That is kind of how I started. But I found that the education piece of it was really fulfilling for me, of just sort of explaining the publishing process to authors and finding out they had really not gotten that explanation anywhere else. So I mostly now do courses and workshops. And so many of the people who come to my courses and workshops are writing books, but I teach my developmental editing method, the what is in the Make Your Manuscript workbook. I teach that in a course, and in that course, I welcome anyone who's working on any kind of text because I do think the system can work no matter what size of text you're working on, whether it's a book or an article or even a thesis or a seminar paper or a conference paper. These methods can be applied to.
I can see that your system, so really thinking about those four aspects, so argument, evidence, structure, and style, would be really helpful just in terms of, like you say, undertaking those revisions and those edits to fix what is perhaps structurally not working in the way that a manuscript has been put together. Which of those four pillars do you find writers often have the most trouble with or are a bit blind to, perhaps?
Yeah, great question. Of course, they are all important, but I would
Of
say
course.
nothing will work if the argument of the piece doesn't work. Everything flows from the argument and is sort of dictated by the argument and is in service of getting that argument across to the reader. And when I say argument, I don't necessarily mean like conflict or something, but the point the author is trying to make, the thing they are hoping the reader will come away believing at the end of the piece. And so if that's not clearly articulated and the author doesn't really understand what they're trying to get across, nothing else is really going to matter very much.
So that's like your main character energy.
Yeah, yeah. So if you know exactly who that main character is, then that helps you make all kinds of decisions about, well, what evidence is needed here? How do I connect that evidence to the argument so it persuades the reader? How do I set up the sequence of my sub-arguments to make sure that the big point is going to come across by the end? And how do I have the right stylistic tone to reach the reader I'm trying to reach? Sometimes formality is going to be really important. Sometimes a more human getting your personal experience across is going to be important. It really depends on, the context of the text. So yeah, I would say the argument is like the most important thing. I would say structure is the area where people struggle, partly because it is a shift from, well, here's how it made sense in my head, or here's the order in which I had the thoughts that brought me to my final conclusion. That order might not be the order your reader needs. It might not be the best way to get across what you're trying to get across. So having a system where you're sort of analyzing the structure of what you've already written and then figuring out if that's the best structure for the final text, that's where having a system is helpful. And that is often what people come to professional developmental editors for, is to sort of untangle the mess of draft they've
Mm.
got. And so what I'm hoping is that the system I offer in this book helps people do it on their own if they would like to try to.
Mm. And when you come to a text, can you see that the argument is not working or that the structure is not working? Are you able to see beyond that in terms of how to fix it? Or is that then a consultation with the author where you say, I think you're trying to say this. Have I got that right? Or, are you trying to say something completely different that is now buried in, chapter 10?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I would say the editing process is sort of iterative and collaborative in that way, where, as an editor, I do think one of my talents as an editor, and any skilled editor, is reading between the lines of what's on the page to intuiting what the author really wanted to get across. It's also a conversation you can have with the author, to make sure you've got that right. But yeah, and then based on that, you make suggestions, and then it's also up to the author to decide, do those suggestions work? Is that taking the piece in the direction I wanted it to, or is this making me realize, like, oh, actually, the argument that's really important to me is the one from chapter 10, and maybe I need to overhaul this entire book to make sure that is central. And so that happens too. So it's not like a straight line necessarily when you're
Mm.
developing a text.
It's so interesting. And which bit do you enjoy the most?
Which bit of the editing
Yeah,
process?
like which aspect do you like getting your teeth into?
I don't think anyone's ever asked me that question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. I do think I like, figuring out what the author's really trying to say. And then there is a kind of satisfaction of almost like doing a puzzle of making your outline of what's on the page and then deciding where the parts need to move to make everything make sense. But I will say it's all hard. Like
Mm.
I wouldn't call any of it like fun because it is work. And so I do want to validate for writers, like it's hard. Getting a manuscript to work in the way it needs to is not easy, and it's not necessarily going to be a fun process, but it's like the satisfaction comes at the end. So I guess my favorite part is when, the manuscript gets accepted for publication and the outcome gets to be realized.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, writing is hard, editing is hard, absolutely. And so, what skills do writers need to be able to develop their own manuscripts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I see missing the most is a lack of awareness of what is expected on the publishing end. So that is absolutely, I think, a skill every writer needs. I don't know if you'd call it a skill or a knowledge, but how do publishers evaluate texts? How do peer reviewers evaluate them? What are the criteria for something being accepted for publication versus rejected or given a revise and resubmit? That's not very clear to most writers, I think. So it can feel like a lot of trial and error, trial by fire. It might even feel like hazing in some ways, which, like, none of those are really positive experiences. So what I am trying to do is help people understand how publication decisions get made, so that not so that you are sort of changing your mission or changing your vision for your work, but so that you're understanding, like, what is going to land, what is going to get me to where I want to go if I want readers to read this. And I think just being aware of that can help you, just save you a lot of time and a lot of, I don't even want to say mistakes, but just like save you from going in a direction that's not going to get you what the outcome that you're looking for.
Mm.
So that's partly why I wanted to break down these four pillars so people can really like put language to what might be getting in the way of their manuscript landing with publishers and peer reviewers. Because I think a lot of the writers I work with just feel very lost or frustrated when they're getting those responses or getting no response. And they just have no idea what would be more effective or what would work. And really what people often think is, oh, well, I'm not smart, or I'm not a good writer, or my research is not relevant, or no one cares about it. And that's not usually the case. Usually it's just that they have not learned how to present all of those things in the way that like speaks the language of academic publishing.
Mm. And is your system discipline agnostic?
Yes.
Mm.
I mostly work with writers in the humanities and social sciences. And so some of the, specific aspects of academic writing that I talk about in Make Your Manuscript Work are sort of geared toward those fields and like the methods of argumentation in those fields. But I would say the bigger picture of manuscript development and attending to the four pillars, that transcends all fields. Often in scientific fields, the structure and format is much more prescribed of the text. So that may even be easier for those writers. But I do think that idea of knowing the point you want to make, making sure the evidence aligns with it, making sure the structure is something that will resonate with your reader, whoever that reader is, and that the style is appropriate to publications in your field, that all could be used by any writer in any discipline, and even by non-academic writers, although this book really is meant to support academic writers.
Mm. Can you talk a little bit more about style? What do you mean? Explain the pillar of style.
Yeah, so I use that word to mean like the overall sort of vibe of the piece, for lack of a better word. Just like kind of the way it's written, the way the author shows up on the page as a person. And that can vary. So, in very formal academic writing, the author may not show up on the page much at all, but that's still a conscious choice that has to be made about how it's written. It's written differently than you'd write in your journal or write a text message to a friend or something. And there may be some manuscripts where you do want to show up more on the page. So it's figuring out the language that will get that across. So it's really just sort of the overall choices the author has made about their mode of expression. One of the big things that comes up there is going back to main character energy. Who is the voice in this piece? Is it the writer, which it almost always should be, or is it other writers or other thinkers, other scholarship that's being cited? That's a big stylistic issue that often comes up in an early draft, where a writer has been so immersed in what other people have to say about their topic, and they're so concerned with sort of like paying the proper respect to what others have said. And they're still testing their own ideas. Their ideas haven't been published yet because they're still writing the manuscript. So they may lack a little confidence in what they are bringing to the table. And so often the balance of voices is sort of off in an early draft. It's tipped more toward others versus the person who is writing this piece. And for the piece to exist, the person who's writing it has to have something to say, right? For someone to want to publish it. So that is an aspect of the style that I'm often working with writers on, is having their own voice and style come through more clearly.
And what do they need to do in order to do that? That seems to me quite a difficult thing to nail down, for want of a better way of putting it.
Yeah, well, often it's just giving less space to other people's ideas. And that's not to say you ignore those ideas or you don't give credit where it's due, but it might be a brief mention rather than several paragraphs of analyzing another writer's work. Unless the topic of the thing is another writer's work. I mean, that's different. But when it's just sort of citing the literature, there's often too much citation of the literature. And there's often not enough interpretation by the actual writer. So they might say, well, here are all these ideas, and they build up to what I'm saying. But you really need to be engaging with each of those ideas and showing how your thinking is building on each thing so that you're not disappearing from the text for paragraphs at a time. The writer's ideas should be in every single paragraph because that's what the reader's there for. The reader is not there to read other thinkers. They would go read those other thinkers if that's what they were looking for. They are there to find out what you have to say.
Mm,
Um, so it is often just about going through what's on the page and saying, "Am I here? What do I have to say about this?" and making sure it's there.
mm. And when academic books can be about incredibly specific topics, how much of these kinds of decisions is shaped by the target readership of the work?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything should be shaped by the target readership of the work. And a reality of book publishing is that you probably need to be trying to speak to more readers than you are. So even if it's niche, for a publisher to want to invest in publishing a book, they need to see that there's potential for, hundreds at least of people to find value in what you're writing. And so one of the things I talk about, in the book is the idea of portability of an argument, that the scope of the argument needs to be a bit bigger than just the specific thing you're writing about. Think about what point you can make about the thing you're writing about that might have value to people who don't actually care about the thing you're writing about, that would have some sort of transcendence to other topics and other fields. That's hard, but that's often one of the real main things I'm working with authors on, like when they take my courses and we work on their book proposals, is like, okay, how do we figure out what's interesting about this beyond the people who wanted to spend 6 years of their life studying this specific thing? Because there's not that many of them. You're the only one writing this book, right? So we have to figure out how this can be interesting to people who are not writing the book, but who might want to read the book. And so you find those points that could connect to other concerns and other questions.
Mm. That makes sense. And we're certainly, familiar with books that have, I guess, leapt out of their niche, as it were. I mean, I'm thinking of things like The Body Keeps Score, for example, that sold, I don't know how many copies during the pandemic,
Yeah.
but that written for a specific audience, but then somehow struck a chord with a much broader readership. I guess that's the dream.
Yeah. And I'll say, I mean, just since we're talking about that book, I mean, that just shows the importance of titles.
Mm,
Like the thesis of that book is in the title, right?
mm,
We know exactly what point that author is trying to make without even reading the book, which I think helps the word of mouth travel. I've had so many people recommend that book to me and I've never read it, and I don't even know if the people who are recommending it have read it, but we all kind of know what it's about and what problem it could solve for the
mm.
reader, right? And so that's an aspect of structure. Of course, it goes beyond structure, but I talk about titles and headings as part of the structure of your book that invite the reader in, that help them understand what they're going to get out of reading either the entire book, the next chapter, the next set of pages. That's one way you can make those ideas land and travel, even for people who will do no more than just look at the cover of the book or even maybe read the introduction or something. But having those elements in place can just like supercharge your ideas beyond the people who will sit and read cover to cover.
Yeah, well, they're all part of the voice of the book, aren't they? One of the phrases in your book that really made me smile with recognition was this idea of directionless tinkering that keeps many writers stuck. I have absolutely no doubt that you see this a lot. And I wanted to know, how do you think writers get caught in this limbo? And if there are any tricks for getting unstuck?
Yeah, well, I think there's two reasons why people get into directionless tinkering. One is just not being aware of an order of operations, of not understanding that developmental editing happens first, and we don't need to worry about tinkering really until later, until the big ideas are in place, the structure is all set, we've made those overarching decisions about style. Then we go in and just apply, to the lower level, like sentence level things. So I think part of it comes from people have never been taught different levels of editing or that different levels of editing exist. So they think polishing sentences is the right thing to be doing at every stage, and it's just not. So that's part of it. Then, I mean, part of it is more of a mental thing where tinkering feels comfortable because it is just little decisions. It's nothing earth-shattering. It's something you know how to do, perhaps. Whereas the idea of, oh, I might have to completely overhaul the structure of my manuscript, that sounds scary. That sounds like maybe I don't even know what the structure should become. I have no idea how to do that. I'm just going to stay here tinkering, right? And so it can feel like I'm putting in my hours, working on my work, when in fact that work is not getting you any closer to where you need to be.
Mm.
I think that is why authors get stuck and aren't sending things off for publication. And because frankly, the things aren't ready to get sent off for publication because they're not dealing with the bigger problems. So I do think the way to get unstuck is A, to understand it's the big picture that matters. Little word choice type things or, grammatical things, punctuation, those actually don't make much of a difference in the initial decision by a publisher whether to keep going with a manuscript or not. So hopefully that comes as a relief to some people, like, well, I don't need to worry about that at the beginning stage. So yeah, so understanding what really matters and what's going to get you the most mileage. Um, and then also, I think just the comfort and confidence that comes from knowing I have a system for dealing with this. I can follow, the outline technique that is laid out in Laura's book or wherever someone is learning it. I think my hope is that that helps people get unstuck to feel like, okay, well, I feel like I need something easy. I need something I know how to do. And I hope that people, instead of tinkering, will now go follow my method so that they can do the big picture stuff that will actually get them to where they want to be.
Yeah, I can imagine that it's pretty daunting to think that perhaps if you start pulling at one thread, the whole thing is going to collapse around your ears. Is there any advantage in putting it down for a while or giving it to somebody else to read in terms of getting a sense of that bigger picture? I mean,
Yeah,
trusted
absolutely.
trusted person, obviously, who's going to be, constructive but kind with feedback.
Yeah, yeah. And that's why, so one of the appendixes in the book is about how to get support. Because at some point, as the writer, there's only so far you can get with putting yourself in the shoes of the reader.
Mm.
You are not the reader, right? That's just the fact. So eventually you do need to have a reader read it and let you know if it's working for them. And so in the book, I do talk about who those readers are, different kinds of readers. And like you say, like a friendly, supportive reader is often helpful. Eventually it will go to people who may not be friendly and supportive, but having those interim readers to help you evaluate your text can be very useful and very confidence building.
Mm. Is there a difference between editing for clarity and editing for readability? Not in terms of the tinkering, which I'm sure comes into that, but in terms of how you organize the text.
Yes, depending on the reader, I guess. So I guess it depends on how you define readability. I think for a lot of academic writing, clarity and readability are the same thing because you are kind of straightforwardly trying to communicate an idea. Where those might diverge a little is if you're trying to write something more narratively, more lyrically, and that's a stylistic kind of thing. If you're trying to write a book that could cross over away from academic audiences, then now we're talking about a differently motivated reader. So an academic reader is often reading for, the content. They want the ideas and they want to be able to apply them. So the more clearly you can get those ideas across and make them absorbable by the reader to be able to be used, great. Like that's the job. When we're talking about non-academic readers, they may be more reading for the experience of spending time with the text or how it makes them feel. And there, then, yeah, how it reads might be different, and the things you prioritize might be different. But yeah, I think for an academic readership, which is like the core readership that most academics are writing for,
Yeah.
clarity is the thing.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I do want to ask you quickly about AI. Is there a role for it? Is it making your life easier, more difficult?
Yeah, I personally don't believe it has a role to play in what I do and the kinds of things I am helping authors with, because I kind of feel like if we're not developing our own human ideas here, then what are we doing here? Like what
Mm.
what is the point of this? It's not just to like generate as many texts as possible or generate as many ideas as possible. It is to have ideas that matter to people. And I don't see a role for AI in that, but I may be left behind as a Luddite. I don't know, but as a Luddite in a very principled political sense, I think, I think the point of what we are doing here is to communicate with each other on a human level and to develop our ideas for the value of them, not for the exercise of doing it,
Mm.
if that makes sense. Like,
No, that makes complete sense to me as I have to admit, a bit of a fellow Luddite and a lover of words and the way that we put them together as humans. Just as a final question before I let you go, do you have any references that you use or texts that you turn to in terms of inspiration or ideas for a better editing process?
yeah. Well, one book that I really highly recommend, and I think it goes very hand in hand with Make Your Manuscript Work, is the Dissertation to Book Workbook by Caitlin Knox and Alison Van Deventer. That book, whether you are writing a dissertation or not, that book is all about conceptualizing your project and thinking about the pieces that need to be in it for it to make sense. And the conceptualization has to happen before you can then work on the development, right? So I think for anyone who is in that phase of they haven't written the entire draft yet, or they are still writing pieces of it, or they have a draft that serves a different purpose, like a dissertation or a thesis, that they then want to turn into something entirely different, like a book, I think that resource is really helpful in getting you to the point where then you can use my book to make that manuscript work for its purpose. So I think they dovetail together very well.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for that recommendation and also for sharing your wisdom and insight on the editing process. I'm sure that our listeners are going to find a huge range of helpful advice and tips and inspiration in this conversation. So thank you so much for your time, Laura. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Laura is so adept at demystifying how a book manuscript or any piece of scholarly writing goes from a collection of ideas or research results on a page to a coherent, evidenced argument that communicates clearly with its intended audience. Without a systematic approach, the writing process can feel, as she says, amorphous and fuzzy. And I liked that she doesn't sugarcoat this process. It's all hard work, whether you're writing or editing, and navigating the road to publication can feel like trial and error, trial by fire, or even hazing in some ways. So, a phase tool with clear signposts can help writers navigate their way to a polished result. I hope this discussion has provided useful tips and inspiration for mastering the skills of self-editing. And so to close this episode, I'd like to thank my guest, Laura Portwood-Stacer. Her book, Make Your Manuscript Work, A Guide to Developmental Editing for Scholarly Writers, is out now on Princeton University Press. If you would like more insight and advice to take your academic writing skills to the next level from experts around the world, check out Campus's latest Spotlight Guide. You'll find it at timeshighereducation.com/campus. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or colleague, like and subscribe, and we'll be back in 2 weeks. Thanks for listening.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.